Hey there, Ritual here to give a big shout out to you for making it through the hectic holiday season. The magic of those family moments, that was you. And now there's new milestones to prep for in 2025. This new year, check clean, quality pregnancy nutrient support off your to-do list with Ritual. We've done the research to create science-backed pregnancy support like our prenatal multivitamin, natal choline, and fertility support, all designed to be taken alongside each other. But don't just take our word for it. They're also third-party tested for microbes and heavy metals and Clean Label Project certified. So whether you're trying, thinking about trying, or already there, we don't have to tell you that prioritizing yourself can be the hardest part. That's why we're helping you get started today with 30% off a 3-month supply for a limited time at ritual.com/podcast. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Big shout out to you for making it through the hectic holiday season. This new year, get clean, quality pregnancy nutrient support off your to-do list, including Ritual's best-selling Essential Prenatal Multivitamin, designed with 12 traceable key ingredients to support a healthy pregnancy. With big changes coming up, take the small steps now and start today with 30% off a 3-month supply at ritual.com/podcast. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Hi there, I'm Kona Gallagher.
And I'm Ethan Flick.
And together, we are the husband and wife team behind And Then They Were Gone, a true crime podcast about unsolved missing persons cases. Each week, we take a deep dive into a case that I have researched and written about and that you have never heard of.
Right. And I react naturally and usually leave you with a whole lot of stuff to edit out with the podcast.
Very true. But I do love getting your analysis and a fresh perspective on these crimes that I've been spending so much time learning about. So you can see us on your favorite podcast app every Wednesday when we release a brand new episode.
And find us on the socials at ATTWGpod.
And you can also visit us on our website, andthentheyweregone.com.
Could you hold the key to bringing someone home?
We are the Brutal, Bizarre, and Boozy podcast. I'm Declan, the son.
And I'm Jane, the mom. This is the podcast where we talk about brutal crimes like serial killers and the random one-off murder. We will tell you about bizarre occurrences like alien abductions and monsters in the dark. And we just might get you drunk with cocktails themed around one of our stories.
At the very end of every show, we like to lighten things up and cleanse the palate from the tragic and terrifying stories. So we end our time with a chaser. You might get to hear crazy stories about our pets or just silly movie recommendations.
Give us a listen. We are the Brutal, Bizarre, and Boozy podcast.
Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 9 of True Crime California. So I just started this podcast a couple months ago. It's already been more successful than I could have ever imagined in such a short time. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in, who's listening. You guys are incredible. The last couple weeks here in LA, I live in LA if people don't know, they've been real rough. There's been, catastrophic fires. A lot of people I know have lost their homes. Air quality's been terrible. Everything kind of was in a standstill. I'm safely tucked away in the valley and I still lost my power for 18 hours and there was ash raining down. It feels like Armageddon a little bit. It feels like the apocalypse, I guess, maybe more appropriately. So it's been a rough couple of weeks here, but Los Angeles is one of the most magic places in the whole world. It's magical. It's fantastic. And I have no doubt that it will come back better than ever as long as we can keep the fucking smart city and fast rail out, which I really worry they're going to put where these families have lived for a long time. So we'll see what happens. Let's jumping into my political hot takes here. I think I wanted to start today with a little bit less on the case because the case that I chose is absolutely disturbing, like just next level awful. And for those of you who listened to Twisted Listers, I actually asked Diva, I said, weirdly, I'm having trouble choosing cases in California or even really finding ones. It's like when somebody asks you your favorite band and your mind just goes completely blank. You're like, I don't listen to music, So I reached out to her and I was like, can you give me some suggestions? And boy, did she. And I think I forgot who I was asking because Diva's like one of the gnarliest people I've ever met in my life. So she, of course, went for, the gnarliest cases. And by gnarly, like she's wonderful. She's intelligent, brilliant, beautiful, wonderful. But like when it comes to true crime, like she does not play. And I just kind of blindly jumped into the case. I knew this case. But I don't think I knew it. I definitely didn't know it the way that I needed to in order to say, hell no, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. So I got myself into this mess and we're going to get through it. I'm going to cover the Toolbox Killer. And I mean, this is honestly like a devastating case. I think for me, researching it, reading things, hearing things, which I'll talk about, and kind of knowing things in a more firsthand manner than the way that most podcasts disseminate the information really, really messed with me. Like I've had some general anxiety since researching this. I've been checking that my doors are locked. I've been like checking on my son at night more. This is one of the most disturbing cases. And I've been doing this, my last podcast I had for 4 years. So this is very, very much like a crazy, tough, horrible case. So I'm just going to get into it. I want to thank you, Diva, for this gift. It's really horrible. So let's just talk about it. Believe it or not, as with the majority of the cases I have covered so far on this podcast, and I promise this will change. This mostly takes place in the late 70s. It's in the LA area. Definitely a theme for our podcast. And the two main perpetrators, absolute devils, are Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. Now, I think Lawrence Bittaker is sort of like the main guy. Like when you talk about the Toolbox Killers, you can also often just find the Toolbox Killer because it's pretty clear who the main aggressor was, who the sadist was. I mean, they're both super sadistic, but when people murder together, there's kind of always a leader and a follower. And I would say that Lawrence Bittaker was absolutely the leader. So much so that sometimes, like I said, when you read about this case, it won't even be plural. It'll just be like, he's the Toolbox Killer. And then Roy Norris was like his sidekick. I'm going to get into some details and you guys can decide for yourselves. I think they're probably like 60-40. So neither one of them is anything more than a complete waste of space in the world. Okay, but now that I've kind of got that out of the way, Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born September 27th, 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Larry's parents were teens at the time and did not really want him or his older brother. His mother was a heavy drinker and his father was abusive. So after a short while, their family convinced them to give up the boys for adoption. Now, you will read a number of things about Larry Bittaker online, and a lot of them are not true and have been debunked much more recently, like, in the last few years, through interviews with Larry, through like research into his family. So if you look on Wikipedia, it's going to tell you that he was in and out of orphanages, I believe, and that he was adopted by like some random people. That's not true. He was actually raised by his parents for a short time and then given up to an aunt and uncle that were within his family. So he was adopted by one of his aunts, but somehow like didn't seem to know who his real mother was at any point in his young life. So I don't know how they worked that around until he got older, that he didn't realize that like his actual mother was within his family. Even as an adult, after he found out he was adopted, there wasn't, as far as I could find, any sort of like reuniting with his mother or meeting at all. Which is interesting because it's an aunt. So it's like what her sister probably was who adopted him, but it still felt very like detached in a way, which is interesting. Maybe it was a very big family. Maybe the siblings were very far apart in age, so it was easier to conceal it. I don't know. What I do know is that this is somewhat similar to our case last week with Marlene Olive. And this is obviously a very, harsh form of trauma for children sometimes to find out that they're adopted. And for Lawrence Bittaker, this was definitely the case. It said that even in his 70s, he was still talking about his mother, which is a very Ed Kemper moment. I can always bring it back to Ed. Big Ed is we will cover him. But Lawrence Bittaker here was very bitter about his mother, I think up until his death. And he even said that if he saw her on the street, that he would want to kill her, which I think is very significant considering what happens. I think it's significant that she's a teenager, or that she was when he was born. I think it's significant that she abandoned him. And I think it's very significant that this stuck with him his entire life.
Hey there. Ritual here to give a big shout out to you for making it through the hectic holiday season. The magic of those family moments, that was you. And now there's new milestones to prep for in 2025. This new year, check clean, quality pregnancy nutrient support off your to-do list with Ritual. We've done the research to create science-backed pregnancy support like our prenatal multivitamin, natal choline, and fertility support, all designed to be taken alongside each other. But don't just take our word for it. They're also third-party tested for microbes and heavy metals and Clean Label Project certified. So whether you're trying, thinking about trying, or already there, we don't have to tell you that prioritizing yourself can be the hardest part. That's why we're helping you get started today with 30% off a 3-month supply for a limited time at ritual.com/podcast. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
And of course, in typical serial killer sociopath fashion, he of course blamed, his growing up, his life, his young life on why he was the way he was. But I think it's really significant to note that he never really focused on his father. He was always on his mother. Another Ed Kemper trait. But, he was just very much angry at his mom his whole life. And I think that's important to note. So he was raised in a very strict and borderline abusive household, which only, added to the trauma that he felt as a child. One of the things that I definitely understand personally as a traumatic kind of thing was that his family moved a lot because his adopted father was in aviation and had to move for work. This left Larry very isolated and unable to make long-term friends because what's the point? I moved a lot as a child and it is really tough, and I do understand that. It does make it difficult to form attachments to people because you're just going to lose them in a short amount of time and have to start over. And so that can be really traumatic as well. You end up kind of feeling hopeless and you kind of just give up on any sort of social stability. Larry was very, very smart. He had an IQ of 138, which is borderline genius, but this can be as much an issue as a good thing, especially when you kind of are young, but you know exactly what's going on. You realize that you're being taken away from people repeatedly. You realize that you're being ignored by your parents, or that maybe your parents don't love you. You are immature, but you're smart. So you pick up on things, but you don't have the ability to process them just because biologically you can't at that point in life. And I think this can lead to a lot of anger issues, especially in somebody like Larry. So when he was pretty young, he started lighting fires. He said he did this to get his parents' attention. And in return, his mother would do things like burn him with cigarettes to teach him not to play with fire. It doesn't make sense, but it's horrific. He also went out at night and harmed animals, which I won't go into. And as he got a bit older, he would sneak out at night and start stalking people and spying on them. Mostly women, but men as well. He just wanted to essentially learn how to stalk his prey. So we're going down a path here for sure. By the time he was 12, he'd already been arrested for shoplifting, which you can imagine did not go over well with his parents. This happened a few more times over his teenage years, and he would later make the excuse that he did it because he had no love from his parents. So again, there he is blaming them for the way that he is, the way that he's acting, when in reality, he knows better. Everything's just an excuse. Nothing is his fault. He downplays everything he does. It's just an obvious pattern and so blatant. And for as smart as he is, it's pretty sad that he doesn't realize how transparent this is. So sometime in high school, so he was in Pennsylvania at this time, and sometime during high school, his family moved to Los Angeles. He had moved around, obviously, but I think he mostly, like, his home base was kind of Pennsylvania, and then they moved to LA, just east, I think, or maybe even in Pasadena. He started school here and sort of fell into the same patterns of crime and trouble. And it's now 1957 at the age of 17. Despite being super smart, Larry drops out of high school. However, before this, while still in high school, he was able to get himself a girlfriend, a pretty blonde by the name of Mary Ann. She was a Catholic girl, so not fast by any means. And one of the things the two of them would do together is they would go hiking in the San Gabriel Mountains. Larry knew these mountains pretty well, as he was a bit of a loner, obviously. So he would show her around to different areas. And this is very important for later, that they spent time in these mountains. It's also significant to note that she wore a cross at all times on her neck. And I'm just going to tell you right now that he used to make some of his victims wear crosses while he tortured them. So, at one point, Larry told Mary Ann that he loved her, and her reply to him was, "I like you a lot." This was a big blow to Larry's ego and stuck with him forever. In a later interview, he admitted to recording himself making out with Mary Ann without her consent up in the mountains, which is really fucking weird. He said he wanted to listen back to it later on, and my assumption is because he wanted to masturbate to it, because this is the kind of guy that he was. And this is very wild to me and also indicative of paraphilia. And right now, I want to take a moment to call out that there are so many similarities between this case and Bill Bonin's case, and not just in the timing and location, which is also pretty crazy, but Bill Bonin also had paraphilia, which is, quote, a persistent and intense sexual interest in atypical objects, situations, or individuals that differs from conventional sexual behavior. It's a pretty broad scope, but I think both of these guys fit that in like every sense. So things like wanting to record these, quote, sessions, or wanting to hurt someone in order to get off, like these are very specific and good examples of paraphilia. So already we're seeing some weird behavior from Larry, and it's not anything new in terms of how serial killers behave, but it's important to note for the story. So, just obviously, again, I say going down a path. So, of course, they break up during high school, and Larry's back on his own and starts getting into trouble again and gets arrested a few more times. And eventually he's sent to the Tracy Dual Vocational Institute in Tracy, California, which is like the middle of nowhere up the 5 freeway. So he's like way up in Central California at this vocational institute, which is essentially like it's a prison for like young people. I believe he's like 17 at this time. And while in this institution, he's given psychiatric evaluations and found to be extremely disturbed, very angry and violent, and not really amenable to therapy. So a lot of big red flags here. However, while he was there, he was underage, so they couldn't keep him. They had to release him. He hadn't really done anything bad enough to keep him forever. They were just like, holy shit, this guy's dangerous. All right, good luck. So they let him go after a pretty short while. When Larry was released, he went home, and I actually found out that this is not exactly true timing-wise. His parents disappeared on him, like stopped responding to him, didn't let him know where they lived. And I read that they did this while he was still a teen, but it actually happened when he was in his early 20s. So it wasn't like as soon as he got out here, he didn't have a home, but it was like fairly shortly thereafter. His parents moved, they left no forwarding address, no number. They just didn't want to know him anymore. So more trauma for Larry here. But at this point, he's old enough that his actions were what led to this. He could have helped it. He could have kept this from happening, but he's just refusing to take responsibility or change his ways. So now Larry's out on his own. He's living in the Hollywood area, and he's not working. He's just doing petty crimes to support himself. He didn't have a job at any point before this that I could find, which is something a little bit different about him. Like, even Bill Bonin had a cover, and later on, Larry does get a job and does kind of have a cover, but it's interesting that in his younger life, he was just kind of just a criminal. Like, that's all he did. So over the next 10 years or so, Larry was in and out of prison for various increasingly violent crimes, including robbery, all sorts of bad shit. Now, during this time, he was further evaluated and found to be highly manipulative and a borderline psychopath. He was given multiple long sentences for up to 15 years each, but kept getting out after only a year or two in prison, only to go back months later, only to be released again. It's the tale as old as time with our California, with our system in general, especially with rapes and things which were not really taken seriously at this point. So it's pretty easy for him to go in for a violent crime and then come back out. Which is exactly what happened over and over and over. Above all else, this institutionalized him, which made him both used to and very comfortable with being in prison, which is super scary because it means that he's not really afraid of punishment, and not being afraid of going to prison will absolutely embolden a criminal to continue criming. They're going to keep doing their crimes, because they don't give a fuck. What are they afraid of? So that's very scary to consider. We're now in 1974, and 34-year-old Larry is high on drugs and alcohol, and he goes to a Ralph's in Hollywood, which I believe to be the rock and roll Ralph's in Hollywood. It's on Sunset, and they called it the rock and roll Ralph's because it's where like all the hair bands and like rock stars would go after they were done like on the Sunset Strip, like doing their thing. Nowadays, it's just like a grimy ass Ralph's in like kind of West Hollywood-ish, and it's just gross. But in its heyday, it was called the Rock and Roll Ralph's, and you would go there to like see, rock stars. But prior to this, it was just a Ralph's, and this is where he went. And just based on kind of the location and what I read about him, I think that's where he was. So anyway, he goes in here and he tries to steal a steak by putting it down his pants. A clerk working there caught him and chased him into like the back of the store. Larry turned around and stabbed the clerk with a pocket knife he had brought with him. Now, when Larry retells this story, it's so ridiculous the way he does this. According to him, he barely remembers anything, of course, because he's so high. And he says things like, quote, apparently I had a pocket knife in my hand. So really just removing him from the situation as best he can. Like, Larry, how'd you get that pocket knife? Where it just appeared? Somebody just like willed it into your hand? Like, come on, you brought it with you. You pulled it out and you stabbed the man. And it's just like every single time he tells a story, it's very passive on his part. Some of the things that he does are the most horrifying things I've ever heard. And the way that he tells it is so insulting and so obvious. I think I've said this a few times, but I really just can't say it enough. So another example of this, I had a pocket knife in my hand. Like, get out of here. Get out of here, guy. So unfortunately, this gets him sent to the California Men's Colony, CMC, which is a prison in San Luis Obispo, which is on the coast in central California. Now, I've read that he was sent to a mental health ward due to this attack and because of his general demeanor and past evaluations. And upon doing more reading, I did find that this prison has those facilities. So I think that he was being treated at this prison, but I don't know. What I do know is that if he was, it did not do anything. He's a sociopath. He was diagnosed as such and more, as I've noted. But anyway, it's unfortunate he got sent here because this situation changed his life and the lives of so many innocent young girls in ways that I don't think anybody ever saw coming. The way that this happened is that this is where he met his future partner in murder, Roy Norris.
Hey there. Ritual here to give a big shout out to you for making it through the hectic holiday season. The magic of those family moments, that was you. And now there's new milestones to prep for in 2025. This new year, check clean, quality, pregnancy nutrient support off your to-do list with Ritual. We've done the research to create science-backed pregnancy support like our prenatal multivitamin, natal choline, and fertility support, all designed to be taken alongside each other. But don't just take our word for it. They're also third-party tested for microbes and heavy metals and Clean Label Project certified. So whether you're trying, thinking about trying, or already there, we don't have to tell you that prioritizing yourself can be the hardest part. That's why we're helping you get started today with 30% off a 3-month supply for a limited time at ritual.com/podcast. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Big shout out to you for making it through the hectic holiday season. This new year, get clean, quality, pregnancy nutrient support off your to-do list, including Ritual's best-selling Essential Prenatal Multivitamin, designed with 12 traceable key ingredients to support a healthy pregnancy. With big changes coming up, take the small steps now and start today with 30% off a 3-month supply at ritual.com/podcast. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Roy Norris was a serial rapist who had been given a sentence of 3 years to life after being prosecuted for a rape in 1957. Now, there's a lot of misinformation about Roy Norris out there, and I'll talk about this for a moment, and then I'll clear up some of the issues. Roy Norris was born in Greeley, Colorado in 1948. He said to unwed parents who got married to avoid the stigma, but quickly gave him up to foster care as his mother was addicted to drugs and his father was mostly absent. He said he went in and out of these homes and would sometimes live with his family, but it was very unstable. And I'm sure that, this is his excuse and what led to him hating his mother and women in general. Now, he also said that he was sexually abused at a young age in one of these homes, which I'm sure would have, contributed to his later sexual deviancy. When he was 16 and living with his birth parents, now this did happen, because this is something he actually said was real. When he was 16 and living with his birth parents, he made a move on an older family member who told his father. Roy said he then attempted suicide by injecting air into his arteries, but failed. His parents at this point told him they no longer wanted him and would divorce when he left home. Now, this is what he says. This is what he wrote to his pen pals after his arrest. In reality, it turns out he had a really stable life with loving parents who took great care of him and his siblings. The only real issue in his young life was that his father's mother hated his mother, but welcome to the world, my dude. That's one of the most common issues in families ever. The women don't get along, the moms and the wives. It's tale as old as time, to be honest. So not really a big deal, but he did come on to that family member. So that is something that happened. But what the point is that he created this whole narrative with people where he was a victim, and that's why he was the way that he was. And in reality, he's just fucked up. There's something wrong with him. So either way, when he was about 17, he did in fact go into the Navy and was sent to Vietnam in 1969. This fucked him up royally, as it did to many young men, which is why I say fuck war, fuck imperialism. It's absolutely not okay to kill innocent people and young children for profit. It's not okay. He was honorably discharged after a year and sent out to wander in the world angry, sexually deviant, and ready to hurt people. And I do want to note that he was discharged for a series of rapes that he committed while in Vietnam, which is insane to me that he was honorably discharged. Way to go, U.S. government. Anyway, I'm sure this emboldened him, and he went to work harming innocent women pretty much immediately upon his release. His first arrest for both rape and attempted rape was that same year in 1969, so either just before or right after being released. And I believe that this led to Navy psychiatrists diagnosing him with schizoid personality disorder before discharging him. So we have an idea of what he's about, but again, they just let him go, which is crazy to me. In 1970, he attacked a woman on a San Diego college campus. I think it was San Diego State or UC San Diego, beating her on the head with a brick after stalking her for hours. He then took her head and beat it on the sidewalk until police arrived. Now, she survived this attack, but what is going on? Why is he doing this? Where did this come from? She's just walking. For this, he was given a whopping 5 years in a Atascadero State Hospital before being released as no further danger to society. This was after being classified as a sexual deviant and after multiple rapes and this attack, which is also the sexual deviant part is something that he shared with Larry. Larry was also classified as a sexual deviant, and both of these men just keep getting released. 3 months after this last release, he raped a woman, shocking, and was arrested about a month after that as she spotted him. She found his motorcycle and called the police and were like, come do your jobs. And they arrested him. And this is when he was sent to the men's colony, which is where he met Larry. Now, here I want to note that obviously rape wasn't taken seriously in the 70s. I mean, it's still not really, but back then it really wasn't, which is obviously a big problem. I kind of already talked about it, but it's really problematic that these two met in prison and then were pretty quickly released after all of the things that they did, which is nuts. I mean, at this point, Larry wasn't arrested for rape, but he was arrested for like pretty much attempted murder. And both of them are just like, all right, do a couple years and go back out into the world. There isn't really anything funny about this story, but one thing that I thought was a little comical was that these two men bonded in prison over making jewelry. There's actually like photos of jewelry that they made together while in prison, which is incredibly random and so off the wall, but it's what brought them together. And during this time, while they were making jewelry, they were also planning out how they would attack women once they were free again, which like, because of course they're going to be free again. So they had all the time in the world here to plan it out. And then once they're out, they put it in action. They planned out all the small details, including agreeing that they would kill their victims to avoid going back to prison. They thought they were going to get a van. They were going to find a dumping ground. I mean, they went all in on this plan. And they went back and forth on like the different things that they could do, where they could go. Let's find a cave. Let's do this. Let's do that. But they really were like putting the pieces in place. And they even told another inmate about it, though he wasn't really invited to join for whatever reason. Maybe he wasn't going to get out of prison. I don't know. But one of the most insane parts of their plan was their agreement to murder a girl for every teen year, 13 through 19, which is really extra sickening that this is just like a game to them. So they planned this, and then in 1978, near the end of 1978, Larry is released from CMC, and he actually gets a job in Los Angeles as a skilled machinist. Now, this paid him about $1,000 a month, which is about $4,800, or I'm so sorry, $1,000 a week. He made $1,000 a week, which is about $4,800 a week in today's money. Now, he started to rent a room in a seedy motel in Burbank, California, which I am recording in Burbank, California right now. The motel, called the Scott Motel, which is after a nearby street, is still there, and it's still like seedy and gross, but it's not nearly as bad as it was in the 70s. The motel's located like by the freeway, kind of off a beaten path. Like really, you're not going to drive there very often unless you're going to the freeway. There is like a park that is kind of like a mouth into actually like a really nice neighborhood, but it's really weird because the road that it's on almost like splits it. There's like the freeway side and then there's like the nice side. So he was on like the freeway side, and it's just not a good area of town. That being said, this was the only time in his life that he really ever like made friends, and his friends would describe him as generous and friendly and helpful. He donated money to the Salvation Army. I mean, here's where this like manipulation comes in, where he's putting up this front. And I think this was all in service of his greater plan to murder these women. Because if you remember, before he met Roy, before they concocted this plan, before he had like an ally, he was just sort of floating through life. He didn't have a job. He didn't really care if he was in prison. He wasn't really doing anything to help himself out or to make himself hide in plain sight. And now he's got this other guy just like him, and he's got something to work towards. And it's just disgusting that this is what he's working towards. Roy Norris got out about, I think, 3 months after Lawrence Bittaker, and they pretty much immediately linked up. Their relationship was described as that of student and teacher, with Bittaker as the teacher and definitely the leader and definitely the smarter one, whereas Bittaker was the larger one. So he was like the brawn, and Bittaker, like Norris was the bigger one, sorry, and Bittaker was the smarter one. Bittaker told Norris he wanted to get a van with a sliding door to get victims in and out more quickly. So that's what they chose to buy. They got a silver GMC van, one of those big 70s ones, and they called it the Murder Mac because it was the size of a Mack truck, according to them. And if you've seen those vans, they are really big, and they've got like the carpeting in the back. They're very 70s. Now, this reminds me again of Bill Bonin, as does the next thing. What these two did was they tricked this out for torture and murder. They added a bed in the back. They included a toolbox full of torture items like pliers, screwdrivers, ice picks, all manner of horrific items. And this is, of course, where the Toolbox Killer nickname comes from. The two, after getting this van, went and found their dumping grounds. And I'll give you all 3 guesses where they ended up going. That's right. They went to the San Gabriel Mountains to look for places to dump bodies. This is absolutely because of the connection to his only girlfriend and the last woman who meant anything to him and who rejected him. They found an old fire road up there with a padlock on it, and they cut the lock, replacing it with their own. They figured, and they were seemingly correct, that nobody would notice as long as there was a lock on the gate. Also, as a note, the area that they found was called Camp Crystal Lake, and I'm just going to leave that there for any horror fans, because that's just too perfect, and they actually took at least 2 victims there. Now, during this time, they actually took photos of each other in this area and sent them to their friend in prison without any, context. So they didn't say, here's where we're going to kill the girls. But he knew what the plan was. So seeing those photos was their way of proving that they were moving forward in their plans. These photos can actually be found online, and they're super weird. It just looks like the 2 of them. One of them's Larry inspecting the lock. One of them is Roy with his hand out, look at the mountain. But it's basically, here's where we're going to dump the bodies. So very, very weird, but not nearly as weird or horrifying as the other photos they take in the coming weeks and months, which we'll talk about, unfortunately.
Hey there. Ritual here to give a big shout out to you for making it through the hectic holiday season. The magic of those family moments, that was you. And now there's new milestones to prep for in 2025. This new year, check clean, quality pregnancy nutrient support off your to-do list with Ritual. We've done the research to create science-backed pregnancy support like our prenatal multivitamin, natal choline, and fertility support, all designed to be taken alongside each other. But don't just take our word for it. They're also third-party tested for microbes and heavy metals and Clean Label Project certified. So whether you're trying, thinking about trying, or already there, we don't have to tell you that prioritizing yourself can be the hardest part. That's why we're helping you get started today with 30% off a 3-month supply for a limited time at ritual.com/podcast. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
It's now early 1979, and 38-year-old Larry Bittaker and 29-year-old Roy Norris start practicing picking up girls. This is something a lot of killers did, again, including Ed Kemper, where they give hitchhikers rides and work on how to engage with them without scaring them too much so that they can sort of figure out how to get people into their van, how they can coax them in so that they could get them to come willingly, and then they can take them up to the mountains, torture, rape, kill them, and then dump their body. And they figure when they dump the bodies in the mountains, they're not going to be found and they're going to be scattered by animals. So it's the perfect place. It's a great way to not get caught. Now, during this time, Roy Norris was still actively attacking women, but was able somehow to avoid capture or even suspicion. And I'm not really sure how. One woman, he raped her and then he just dropped her in the desert. And as far as we know, she survived, but she never turned him in. Finally, the 2 pick a date and they decide to go out hunting. They're ready. They've done their trial runs. Everything's in place. They have their dumping ground. They have their murder Mac. They're good. And on June 24th, 1979, they went to Redondo Beach to look for a victim. And they found 16-year-old Lucinda Cindy Schaefer walking from her church to her grandparents' house. It does not get more wholesome than that, which makes this all the worse. So on seeing her, they knew that's not the kind of girl that's going to accept a ride from us. So they threw their plans out the window and just rolled up and grabbed her straight off the street. They just picked her up, threw her into the van, and tied her up. At first, Cindy screamed, but they both said that she eventually fell quiet, almost as if resigned to her fate. According to both men, she ended up being almost cooperative, which is something that Bittaker in particular loves to mention when recounting the rape and murder of this child. Not only because it makes him sound less culpable, but because rapists, they just love when victims, quote, give themselves over, because it's part of the power trip. She really wanted it. I wasn't raping her. She was a part of it. And it's fucking disgusting. And the way that we know that this is true, that she really did sort of stop fighting, was that in addition to Larry saying this, Roy Norris also said this. So both of them had sort of the same story about this victim. He, however, Roy Norris, was more accurate in his description of Cindy, saying that she was detached, she seemed far away from everything happening to her, which I think was shock. She was in shock. And so that's why she was that way. So they drove her to the mountains. Bittaker then took a walk while Norris raped her for about an hour. They then switched and Bittaker had his turn. And from there, I think they switched off a couple of times, I hate to say. And then they argued over what to do with her. Now, Roy Norris was getting cold feet and didn't want to kill her. But Larry said, we have to or she'll give us up. Do you want to go back to prison after one? Like, we agreed to kill the victims. At one point, Cindy, sort of picking up on what was going on, asked them, are you going to kill me? And she said, if you are, please just let me pray first. The response from the men was, no, we're not going to kill you. But they also laughed at the request, as if she was an idiot for even asking. They then did, in fact, kill her. They started to strangle her, and they did not allow her time to pray, of course. Now, Roy Norris first tried to strangle her, but after about 45 seconds, he saw the terror in her eyes. And he backed away retching, as it actually made him sick, which is the proper response. So Larry Bittaker, fucking sociopath, psychopath, took over. And while he didn't have any problem emotionally with doing this, he wasn't actually strong enough to finish the job. So he ended up letting go of her neck after a few minutes. As a result, Cindy began convulsing on the floor of the van. And I can only hope that she was unconscious and not aware of what was going on, because that's just fucking horrific. So to get her to stop, Bittaker then took a coat hanger and pliers out of the toolbox and wrapped the hanger around her neck, tying it so tightly that it cut into her skin. Eventually, she stopped moving and breathing and was dead. They then rolled her into a shower curtain and threw her body down the mountainside. There's a really interesting documentary about Larry Bittaker on Peacock. And honestly, it's about the cases, but it's more about Larry. And in one of the interviews, he does everything he can to downplay this murder. But it's like, you had a shower curtain ready to roll her body in your van. Like, how do you deny forethought when you have a murder toolbox and a shower curtain? Again, it's just another example of him like thinking he's smarter than everybody and clearly not being. Now that's murder one. About 14 days later, on the 8th of July, 1979, these two go out again to find another victim. And this time they pick up 18-year-old Andrea Hall, who was hitchhiking from Manhattan Beach to, I've read a couple different places, but I think it was Wilmington or Long Beach, to go see her boyfriend. Now this one is crazy because these two men wanted to pick up Andrea, but before they had a chance, another man picked her up first. So they followed his car. They followed him while he gave her this ride, waiting for him to drop her off, hoping that he wasn't taking her to her final destination. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. And also, unfortunately, she never realized that they had been following her. So she gets out of the car, and Roy Norris hid himself under the bed in the back of the truck the back of the van while Larry picked her up. I don't know if I mentioned this, but they also built a bed into the back of the van, which is another, like, you cannot say that wasn't on purpose. And he's like, oh, I need it as a backup house. And it's like, you make $1,000 a week. You could buy a house outright with cash, but you need a bed in your van. Like, get out of here, guy. So again, she gets into the car or into the van with Larry. He tells her, oh, I've got a cooler of cold drinks in the back. Go ahead and grab one. So she jumps up, goes into the back to grab one, and Roy Norris pops out and attacks her, tying her and gagging her before they made their way to the mountains once again. And I wanted to call out that Andrea fought like so bravely, and she almost overpowered Roy Norris, who was over 200 pounds and over 6 feet tall. He was a big man. And it was so bad that at one point Larry had to slam the brakes on to break them apart because she was actually winning this fight and was maybe going to get away. Unfortunately, that is not what happened, but I did want to call out that she fought her hardest. And that doesn't make her a better victim than Cindy or anybody else, but I just want to call out that she tried so hard because I think it's important to know who she was and that she fought for her life. So they get her in the van, they overpower her, and they drive up to the San Gabriel Mountains. And this time they actually go past where Cindy was killed, and they pull over and they take turns raping Andrea. Again, one will leave while the other attacks her. Then they move her up the hill because I think a car was coming. And Larry actually went up there with her on his own and took his Polaroid camera with him. Now, another thing they had in their toolbox was a pair of walkie-talkies, so they could stay in contact to know when to come back to the van, or just in case like the girls got away, or, it's just another piece of their sort of planning. So he was gone with Andrea for 2 hours and took multiple photos of her in various poses, and also forced her to perform oral sex on him. And yeah, it's getting to the point, like, it's making me a little sick to talk about this, but we're going to keep going. So one of the horrible things that he did, so he did a lot of fucked up things, but one of the things that he did was he would make the girls pretend that they were enjoying themselves while they were having sex with him. He would make them talk like they were having a good time, like they wanted to be there. And this is all part of that like weird sadistic thing. But also him wanting them to like give themselves over. And so, later on, he could say, well, they were into it, they wanted it, whatever. It's super twisted. But he also had like a purely sadistic side that wanted to see the girls suffer. And so 2 of the Polaroid photos that were later found showed Andrea and her face and this horrified look on her face. And it was this way because he took these 2 pictures of her moments after he told her that he was going to kill her. And he said, I'm going to kill you. You need to think of as many reasons as you can as to why I shouldn't. So just very over the top sadistic shit, like really just getting off on the fear and anguish that he's causing her in this moment. So they took her back down the hill, and Norris stood by while Bittaker did the killing. And this one was as bad as the rest of it, or more terrible. I don't know. To kill Andrea Hall, Bittaker took an ice pick out of his toolbox and shoved it through her ear into her brain. Now, this did not kill her immediately. He did not get it far enough into her ear. So she's just in an intense amount of pain, but not dead, but probably immobilized by this. He then pulls it out and shoves it into her other ear and jumps on it, meaning she's laying on the ground. So he's jumping on this handle and her head, pushing this thing into her brain. This is what this man does. And he actually did this until the handle broke. And then, just to make sure that she was dead, he strangled her body. He then rolled her down the hill. Now, I'm not sure if he recorded her rape and murder. Actually, I do believe that he did. But I know he took audio of the next murders, including one that we'll talk about, that this is like a big trigger warning case. A lot of this, it's going to get worse from here. So one of these recordings I'm going to talk about in some amount of detail. And so if that's not your thing, I will give a warning. But this was sort of his thing, was recording these attacks. So we will get there. When we do, I'll let everybody know. But yeah, it's just really twisted. So Andrea, they've killed her. They rolled her body down, into the canyons. And their next victims, we're just going to get into it, were 13-year-old Jacqueline Leah Lamp. She went by Leah. And 15-year-old Jacqueline Jackie Gilliam. These 2 girls were hitchhiking near Redondo Beach, looking for a ride to the beach, in fact. And Bittaker later said he had no idea why they were hitchhiking, as they were literally minutes from the beach, even on foot. He was like, it made no sense why they would be hitchhiking, but they were, so we picked them up, which is absolutely fucked. They, of course, these men took them back out to their spot, this time actually to Crystal Lake, which was this super hidden area, the abandoned cabins that I kind of talked about, that was way up on the top of one of the mountains. I should note that nowadays this is a popular hiking trail, and part of me wants to go check it out. Part of me wants to stay as far away from it as possible because I don't know how I'll feel when I'm there. But it is interesting that this is just like a place that people go hang out now. Anyway, so they get up there and the torture begins. Before this, though, I did want to call out that the girls nearly escaped, and it's so awful to me and so sad that they didn't. Because for whatever reason, in this instance, the men cannot await to attack the girls. So Norris hits one of them in the head with a sock full of BBs, like metal BBs, knocking her unconscious temporarily. He does this to Leah. I think what was happening is the men, they were like sharing a joint in the back of the van. And the girls started to notice, like, hey, we're not driving toward the beach. We should already be there. Like, what's going on? So they're starting to get nervous. And instead of like, I don't know, making an excuse, like, who knows, the thing that they practiced for so long, Norris pulls out this thing of BBs and hits her on the head. Now, Leah passes out, and he goes and he then tries to overpower Jackie. And so he's tying Jackie up when Leah regains consciousness, opens the van door, and runs screaming out of it. And somehow they're next to a tennis court, and there's people playing tennis. Norris runs out, or no, not Norris. Bittaker got out of the van and went around it and punched her in the face as hard as he could and then shoved her back into the van. Tennis players saw this. People at this location saw this. And what he said to them is, she's having a bad acid trip. And then throws her back in the van and they drive away. Nobody ever called the cops. Nobody ever did anything about this. This is a 38-year-old man and a 13-year-old girl. And a fucking molester van. And they're just like, whatever, I'm going to keep playing tennis. And it makes me so mad that this is the way that people dealt with this, because it was just such a close call, you know? And these little girls just did not get to escape because people just didn't want to, I don't know, be involved. I don't really know. Each and every one of these murders is horrific in its own special way. But this one, to me, would be particularly horrifying. Because what they did was they took these girls up to the mountains and they tell Leah, oh, you're too fat and ugly. We don't want to have sex with you. Which, like, of all the things they do, it still bothers me that on top of everything else they did that. They think Jackie Gilliam is good looking. So they begin taking turns raping her. And I believe that they would have done this either way, but it's said that when Bittaker found out she was a virgin, he decided that he wanted to record the rapes using the tape recorder, which I think he would have done anyway, because that's what he did. I believe that he did actually tape Andrea Hall. I think had he kept going, he would have produced more of these tapes. So he takes a tape player out and records her screaming while he's raping her. And then he also makes her pretend to like it and records that. They tie up the girls, they gag them after this like horrifying, abuse. And then they make them sleep with them in the van overnight up on the mountain, like they're camping or something. So these little girls endured this torture and rape for nearly 48 hours. And now, like I said, Leah was not, as far as I know, raped, but Jackie was. So the next morning, after like the first day of abduction, Lawrence Bittaker takes Leah up somewhere, and he does take sexually explicit photos of her. But again, at least according to him and according to Norris, neither one of them actually raped her, but he did make her get naked and take these humiliating, horrible photos of her and made her pretend that she liked it. He then raped Jackie Gilliam at least 3 times in total and recorded all of these rapes. The recordings of these have not been released, but it's still said in them that he tells her to pretend she's his cousin, tells her to feel free to express her pain that she's feeling, and he also tortured her by stabbing her breasts with an ice pick, as well as tearing part of her nipple off with a pair of pliers, which is insane. She's 15. I mean, any age, but like, what the fuck? He also has Roy Norris take Polaroids of him and her together, including while he's forcing her to have oral and vaginal sex with him. So he's raping her. These photos are online, not the ones of them together, but the nude photos of her. They're online and they're haunting. He makes her smile for these photos. In one of these photos, she's smiling and you can see that she has a black eye. I mean, it's just beyond. It's so insane. And we're not even to the trigger warning part yet, if you can believe it.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/audio.
So after about 48 hours of this terrible rape, torture, just humiliation of these 2 little girls, they then, of course, murder them. Now, first, they took them to town to get supplies. Again, it's like a little fun camping trip with friends. But then they go back up to the mountain and they somehow separate the girls. Bittaker murders Jackie Gilliam. And despite Norris saying, like, we should kill her quickly because she was so cooperative, she did everything we asked, Bittaker said no because, quote, they only die once anyway. So apparently he needs to make it count. He then stabbed her in the ear with the ice pick, then took it out because she was still alive and stabbed her in the other ear. He was not able to remove the ice pick from her ear this time, so he just rolled her body down the hill with the pick still in her head. He then made Leah get out of the van, and as she walked out, he made Roy Norris hit her on the head with a sledgehammer 7 times. Now, this was in part because Roy had not actually killed anybody yet. Like Cindy, when he tried to kill her, he couldn't do it. So this was his turn. So he was going to kill Leah because Bittaker killed the other 2. Bittaker then went to strangle her, and when he realized she was still alive, he also hit her on the head with a hammer and rolled her body down the hill as well. These men are absolute devils, like truly. These 2 young girls had been abducted on September 2nd and died September 3rd, 1979. And we have one more victim to go over, which I'm very happy to say there's only one more, but this one is our trigger warning murder. Now, this is the last victim was 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. Now, she went by Lynette, but her name was Shirley Lynette Ledford. Because of all the recordings, you can actually find a piece of this one online, and it will ruin your week if you listen to it or if you read a transcript of the attack, which I did. I regret it immensely, so I would suggest you don't go looking. It's really bad. This poor sweet little girl, like what they did to her, and really like knowing about it, hearing about it, it's too much. It's just too much. It's so much different when you hear a recording or you see something happen or you read about it than when you're being told it in a story. For some reason, when somebody else is telling you the story, it takes you out of it just enough that it's not quite as sickening. And I know that sounds crazy because this is super sickening, but this is just like, I don't know. This messed me up. So Shirley was a sweet, or Lynette, I should say, was a sweet, quiet girl who lived in Burbank and worked at a restaurant that Bittaker frequented. I think it was like the McDonald's in Sunland. And I do believe they used to have like table service and waitresses. So I think she was kind of like a waitress there. And so he knew her from those interactions. In any case, it was Halloween night, October 31st, 1979. And Lynette was hitchhiking home from a party when Bittaker and Norris picked her up. It's thought that she was willing to go with them because she knew Larry, which is extra twisted. They get her in the van. They offer her weed. She actually said no. She's like, no, I'm good. I don't do that. So then they just kind of cut to the chase and they pull a knife on her. And this time they don't drive up to the mountains. And I think this was because Lawrence Bittaker wanted to taunt the police. The police at this point didn't even know that he was operating in the area because it was only 4 girls. They treated everybody like a runaway at that time, like any young girl that goes missing. They're like, oh, she ran away. Like, call us in a month. So they didn't really know that he was doing what he was doing. And so it's believed that on top of everything else, he wanted the notoriety. And so he was taunting them with this kill. So he did not go up the mountain this time. Instead, they just drive around the city. They just drive around Burbank and Sunland. And while they're doing this, I guess they actually pulled over somewhere in Burbank. I do not know where. I don't really want to know where, but it's off the beaten path. And here, Bittaker rapes her violently. He tortured her. He tore at her nipples with pliers. He raped her orally, vaginally, and he sodomized her. He beat her with his fists while demanding she scream louder and louder. We'll get to more, but the only way you can find any part of the recording online now is from a newsman who was recording outside of Bittaker's trial later on. And every time someone came out of the courtroom, the door opens for a moment and you can hear the recording. You can hear her screaming. And the door opened quite a few times because so many people were escaping the courtroom while this was playing because it was so beyond disturbing and horrifying. And even the little bit that I heard was more than I should have heard. It was a mistake. I also looked up the transcript and it fills in the blanks and is one of the most depraved things I've ever read. Don't do it, trust me, like I said. But some snippets of the transcript of these few hours they spent with Shirley include Shirley being forced to say she enjoys what's happening to her, telling Norris, "I'll scream if you stop hitting me," repeatedly screaming, "Oh no," and "No, no, no, no," and the men laughing and ordering her to say and do horrific things. There's also the sounds of her being beaten, the sounds of her crying. During the attack, and you can hear this as well, I didn't hear it, but it's on the recording, so someone heard it. Bittaker took the pliers and stuck them inside of her rectum, tearing it open, and then sodomized her again. During this horrific, it was actually only about 2 hours, which is 2 hours too long. But during this abuse, Roy Norris, not wanting to be left out, took a sledgehammer and hit Shirley on the elbow 25 times until her bone was completely pulverized. After the first time he hit it, she told him, "You broke my elbow." And he hit her 26 times after that. Finally, after this horrific torture and rape, the two strangled her to death with a wire hanger that, when removed from her neck later, was about the size of a silver dollar. And if people don't know, it was like 2 inches, 3 inches wide. I mean, I'm sure it cut through her skin, and not just cut through it, but like very much damaged her. Shirley's last words were, "Do it, just kill me." And those are in the recording. For a 16-year-old to ask for death in that manner really drives home how horrible this was. And to add insult to all of this, the men posed Shirley on someone's front lawn in Sunland, just leaving her splayed out, completely visible. She was found the next morning, either by the resident or by a jogger jogging by. Now, as a note, at this time, Shirley was the only body found. So again, police have no clue what's going on. And I believe that if these two had been able to kill more girls, they would have started to leave their bodies around to draw attention. Because I think, in addition to everything else, that's what they wanted. They wanted the notoriety, or at least Bittaker. I think Norris less so, but he was the follower, so he was going to do whatever Bittaker wanted. And I say they wanted the notoriety because I think in addition to leaving Shirley's body to be found, they also had big fucking mouths about these murders. Bittaker himself had told multiple people at the motel, going as far as showing them photos, like the Polaroids of these young girls, and saying these young girls wouldn't be able to come forward because they were dead. He told at least 3 people about these murders, and at the time, none of them came forward. However, they did all testify later. Now, before they killed Shirley, the two had attacked another woman inside her parking garage where she was trying to go from her car to her house. In this case, they maced her, but she started screaming, and so the neighbors came out and the men took off. This put the scare into Bittaker, so he was laying low for a while, but then about a month later, he killed and posed Shirley. So what I'm wondering is, did he enjoy the rush, that feeling of almost getting caught? So did that become like the new thing he wanted to do? I don't know if that, is the case, but I do know that in addition to this attempted abduction, there were at least 2 other attempts, at least according to Bittaker. So this was all really terrible. It was a really gnarly case. But now we're going to kind of talk about how they got caught, which is definitely my favorite part of this so far. Because again, it's just these idiots having 2 big mouths and getting themselves caught. And maybe, they want to go back to prison. Like I said, they were institutionalized. They spent so much of their lives there. The psychology behind this is really interesting, to be sure. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't really get into it, but it's definitely interesting to kind of think about why the things transpired the way that they did. But in any case, in November of 1979, just after Shirley's murder, Roy Norris reconnected with a friend from prison, a serial rapist named Joseph Jackson. The two met up and were hanging out, both, free. And I guess as ex-cons do, they're hanging out and shooting the shit. And out of nowhere, Roy just straight up tells Joseph, "Hey, I've been killing people with Larry. We've been killing all these little girls." Joseph, a father of 2 girls himself, was horrified. Even though he's a rapist, he later said, well, I have young daughters and it freaked me out. And he hid it very well from Roy. He didn't let on, that he was going to tell anybody. Later, he said he thought about how Roy would ask about his daughters, and he would do it in this way that made him really uncomfortable. So when he told him about this, he was, very sure that he didn't want to keep this to himself. Because as a father, he was this could be my daughters. He could have killed them, So Joseph Jackson then goes and speaks with his lawyer, who advises him, take this information to the police, and he does just that. From there, the case was sent to the Hermosa Beach Police Department, where Detective Paul Bynum was assigned the case. Now, from the start, he believed Jackson, at least enough to investigate the claims seriously and immediately, including going to a woman in Oregon who had reported being raped by 2 men in a van, and he went up there and showed her their mugshots. She immediately picked out Bittaker and Norris from a lineup of 12 mugshots. This was enough for police to start putting the 2 men under surveillance, and pretty quickly they found that Norris was dealing drugs. They pulled up on his car and they found a bag full of weed, tons and tons of weed. So he gets arrested for this, and then very quickly thereafter they arrest Bittaker for the rape, because he had an actual job, so there wasn't really anything going on that they could use to arrest him. But pretty quickly after they arrest Norris, they're just like, fuck it, we're just going to arrest Bittaker for the rape. Let's get him off the street. Let's start, the search of his home, of his van. Let's just do this. Now, unfortunately, Bittaker had a little hint that something was up, because he'd actually called Roy Norris during the police raid, and he went and cleared out his van of all items just before his arrest. So he gets rid of the toolbox, he clears the bed out, any, blood, anything else that's obvious, he takes out of his van, except for one item that he forgot to remove. This item was the 2-hour-long torture tape of Lynette Ledford, which he had, of course, been listening to and failed to remove from the tape player. This piece of evidence is obviously very damning, but police also searched Larry's motel room, and there they found some of his Polaroid collection. So now they have an audio source, they have photos. I mean, the case is coming together. I also wanted to call out that police also found several bottles of acid in his room, like the kind you burn skin with. So this man is really starting to ramp up the torture, and he was definitely going to start torturing his next victims using acid. Now, in Roy Norris's home, they found even more Polaroids. In fact, over 500, including tons from Hermosa and Redondo Beach, where I guess they were just taking photos of girls on the beach. And they even found some from girls from Burbank, like girls walking to and from high school. So absolutely terrifying. They also apparently had their next 2 victims picked out, including a 13-year-old. So they're just already, they're continuing their plan. They're stalking more. They're planning more. They're ramping things up. It's terrifying. It's so good that they were caught when they were. So the men, like I said, they're arrested. And before they go to trial, Roy Norris strikes a deal with prosecutors. So he was able to avoid the death penalty, which was a thing in the state at the time. And in return, he would both testify against Lawrence Bittaker and also take police to the locations of the bodies. In return, he would only get a life sentence and not face the death penalty. Now, unfortunately, they were only able to recover Jackie and Leah's bodies, while Cindy and Andrea's were not found during these searches. But at least it's something. At first, Norris completely denied any involvement in the crimes, but after being interrogated for a while, he sort of just spilled the beans, and he talked about all 5 victims. He also said that they attempted to pick up many, many more, but had been rejected pretty often, which is really good to hear, because who knows how many more they would have killed given the opportunity. That being said, it was later found that 19 of the girls in their Polaroids had been reported missing, which is very concerning because who knows what happened to them. And what's more, there was a photo of a girl with the 2 of them in the mountains in similar circumstances to the victims, and she has never been identified. So we don't know if she was a victim and they just chose not to mention her or what the situation was. So we really don't know how many girls they killed. We know they killed 5. But we don't know if they killed more. Anyway, so the 2 go to trial. They, of course, blame each other. Bittaker even took the stand at his trial, which was ridiculous, and he tried to blame Roy Norris. He even went as far as saying there was yet another unnamed man involved in at least one of the rapes. He also, of course, said that most of the victims were sex workers and accused Lynette Ledford of being a drug-addled psycho, saying that the screaming on the video was because she was on drugs. It was just absolutely ridiculous, completely insulting to victims, just unreal. At one point, this motherfucker broke down crying. Obvious crocodile tears, like just unbelievably terrible acting job. It was just a really silly thing and sad because he actually thinks he's going to fool someone. And it's like, sir, you aren't fooling anyone. It took the jury a little more than 2 days to come back with the guilty verdict, and they believe the reason for this was that people were going back and forth over the death penalty. There was no, question of his guilt. It was more a question of the penalty, and they did come back and give Lawrence Bittaker the death penalty for sure. Roy Norris was given the 45 years to life sentence that he had agreed upon, and it was sort of a done deal. The death penalty, though, was actually really significant because the DA at the time was opposed to the death penalty, but he allowed it to be used in this case, which I would say is understandable. I personally don't believe in the death penalty, but in cases like this, it's kind of hard to defend that a little bit. I mean, I'm still against it, but, it's hard sometimes. I've said that before. Now, during the trial, just to kind of drive home why the death penalty was sought and given as an option, the prosecution played 17 minutes of the 2-hour-long torture of Lynette Ledford. And during this time, jury members and those in the courtroom openly wept, with many of those who were able to leave literally running out of the room. There was not a single person in the courtroom who wasn't completely horrified by the tape. FBI agents, police, and even the prosecutor on the case said it was the worst thing they've ever heard in their careers. The prosecutor said that he had nightmares for months about this man murdering girls and him not being able to save them, which is really sad and also very sweet, but just generally horrifying. There was a reporter outside the courtroom who interviewed people as they left, and many of these people were in tears. I mean, people were just sick over it. Everyone except, of course, for Larry Bittaker, who during the playing of this tape sat there stone-faced, reading along to the transcript, and I guarantee you he was enjoying every minute of it. This man is just pure evil. It's absolutely insane. Despite being given the death penalty, which was a very, out of the ordinary thing at this time, he was somehow able to procure a full stay of execution after delaying his death sentence twice. He got it delayed once in 1990, again in 1991, and then they just gave him a full stay of execution. Usually, it takes years and years for somebody to be put up for death after being accused, but this was within like a 10-year timeline. So they were really trying to get him put to death, and he fought back and somehow was able to get out of it. Crazy. And now, there's a moratorium on the death penalty in California. So, a lot of people who are on death row are they're just in prison. Now, while in prison, Roy Norris was pretty boring. There's not a lot to say about him, but Bittaker made everybody's lives hell. He filed so many frivolous lawsuits, he was actually barred from filing without a lawyer or judge's permission. He was filing over things like being served a broken cookie at lunch, citing that as cruel and unusual punishment. So, I mean, he's very smart, but he's just an annoying, like a troll. He's just a piece of shit in every way. He also gave a ton of interviews throughout his time in prison, but never once expressed any remorse, and in fact often said he wishes he could go back to his life, which I'm sure, he meant that, Now, later on, closer to his death, he did a series of interviews with a woman named Laura Brand, who did an extremely deep dive with Larry while he was in prison. And I think I talked about this up at the beginning of this. It was like a documentary that came out, and it's really just kind of based on her experience with him. She later said they became friends, which really scares me because it goes to show how good this guy is at pulling the wool over people's eyes. I mean, she was there in an official capacity. She's a criminologist. She's interviewing him basically to get more information about like where the bodies were, trying to like help the victims' families. And somehow she ends up coming to visit him with her son in San Quentin. Like, it's wild. Now, to be fair, she did get him to draw her a map of the location of Cindy and Andrea's bodies, but it's been, nearly 40 years since the murders. So as of now, even with those maps, they still have not been found. But at least now we have like a general idea of where they may be. And so if people continue to look, hopefully one day they will find them so they can be put to rest and their families, can get some closure. But I just want to call out that it's really crazy that this woman actually said, like, I do believe that he felt some remorse and I do believe that he cared for me. And I'm just like, no, I really don't think that's the truth. And it scares me that he's that good. Anyway, Lawrence Bittaker died in prison after being diagnosed with cancer and suffering a series of heart attacks. He died aged 79 on December 13th, 2019 in San Quentin. Just before his death, I said he drew Laura that map. I don't think it had anything to do with the victims of the families, but rather with his own mortality. He didn't want the death penalty. He didn't want to die. He cried on the phone to her after his heart attacks. So I think, like everything else, his drawing this map was self-serving. It was like his way of making himself feel better somehow. Anyway, he died, and not even 3 months later, on February 24th, 2020, Roy Norris died at age 72 in the Vacaville Medical Center, also in California. It's very interesting that they died so close together, but I'm very glad they are both dead. And that's about it. The documentary on Peacock is called The Toolbox Killer. It's really interesting. It's definitely not a deep dive in terms of the specifics of the case, which I think is great because some of those specifics are pretty awful. But even without those specifics, it's still a very unsettling, but ultimately very informative documentary. So I do suggest everyone check it out. Do not check out the audio or the transcript from Lynette's murder, please. Just don't do it. Don't do it. It's awful. It's not worth it. One more thing that I kept forgetting to write down in my notes. The detective who was assigned this case, Paul Bynum, he actually committed suicide after this case. And in his suicide note, he mentioned Lawrence Bittaker. And he said he thought that if he got out of prison, which it's fair to assume he would, he did over and over, that he would come after him and his family. And he thought that if he killed himself, that Lawrence would spare his wife and children. So that is just another note about how scary this man is, how horrifying this case was. And I don't think that this man committed suicide only because of this case, but I do believe that it was the straw that broke the camel's back, because detectives, especially in the 70s and 80s, the horrific crimes that were taking place, it's a lot. It's a big mental load. And honestly, like, just researching this case, I mean, I think I made it pretty clear how tough it was. So I can't imagine what it was like for the detectives or the lawyers, the prosecutors, anybody dealing with this. These men were horrible monsters. I am so glad they are dead. I know a lot of people are upset that they died natural deaths, but I feel like as long as they were off the street and couldn't hurt anybody else, that's fine. Just get them out and away and don't let them hurt anybody else. So, all right, this is a tough one. This is an awful case, really devastating, really disturbing. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. I know it's a little longer than my standard cases, but I didn't want to split it up into two because I don't think any of us can handle this for more than a week. So thanks everybody for hanging in there with this one. I know it was rough. Please like, rate, review, share with your friends and family. If you know of any, cases that you want me to cover, please feel free to email me. My email is truecrimecaliforniapod@gmail.com. I'm always looking for good cases. And if I keep going to Diva, they're going to be like this. So let's get some variety in there. Let's get a little fluff. I mean, there's no fluff where murder is concerned, but maybe some disappearances, something a little less hardcore. Please feel free. Send me anything and everything. And again, thanks again for listening. I appreciate all of you. And until next week, stay safe.